Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Haitian American Museum of Chicago's program tonight, Healing Black Chicago 101, DuSable to Harold Washington, with Dr. Rhonda Sherrod. This program is a part of a series at the museum that explores topics related to Haitian history, art, and culture, and topics surrounding the diaspora. My name is Carlos Bossard, and I'm the executive director of the museum. It is great to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. HAMOC's mission is to promote and preserve Haitian art, culture, history, and community in Chicago and beyond. Education is at the core of our mission, and we are glad to continue bringing insightful, meaningful, and impactful lectures and programs to the community. Tonight, we are also joined by HAMOC's founder and president, Ms. Elsie Hector Hernandez. Elsie, did you want to say a few words to the group?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on board. I'm Elsie Hector Hernandez, originally from Haiti and the founder of the museum. Thank you so much for all of you that are here today for this wonderful, great lecture. So thank you so much and enjoy.
Thank you, Elsie. We appreciate you being here. Before we do begin, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping and let you all know the format of tonight's event. First, this program is being recorded, and if you do not wish to be seen, feel free to turn your cameras off now. The recording will be available on our YouTube here in just about a week or so. Also, all of you were, I think, automatically put on mute as you entered the room, but please make sure to stay on mute throughout the presentation to make sure everyone can hear the presenter clearly. Also, auto-generated captioning has been turned on for accessibility reasons, and if you do need that transcript, that can be available to you at the end of the presentation. And lastly, and most importantly, after the presentation, there will be a Q&A session with Dr. Sherrod, moderated by HAMOC's educator and grant writer, Ben Henderson. Ben has been with the museum for over 2 years now and continues to be a huge asset, supporter, and friend of the museum. Ben?
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Henderson, and I'm the educator and grant writer at the museum. As Carl states, the Q&A will take place after the presentation. However, feel free to put your questions in the chat for Dr. Sherrod during the presentation. During the Q&A, all questions must be made through the chat. I will be monitoring the questions throughout the program and relaying them to Dr. Sherrod. Dr. Rhonda Sherrod is a professor of psychology who specializes in restorative justice and is the founder of the Need to Know Group, a nonprofit that deals with Black trauma and healing, a multidisciplinary approach that combines history, sociology, political science, sociology, legal, and economic analysis in order to solve these problems. She is the author of Surviving, Healing, and Evolving, a mental health book for Black women, adolescents, and people who struggle from trauma from sexual assault and violence. For today's program, Dr. Sherrod will use her expertise to discuss the importance of restorative justice and how Black history empowers Black communities and plays an important role in improving their mental health and well-being. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Sherrod.
Hi. Am I on? Hello.
You are good to go.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for coming. I am, as he said, Dr. Rhonda Sherrod, and I wrote a book called Surviving, Healing, and Evolving, Essays of Love, Compassion, Healing, and Affirmation for Black People. And one of the things I wanted to do, because my book is divided into 3 sections, it's for myself, which explores my own personal trauma that I endured as a young child, and then it's section 2 is for my sisters, which talks about some of the traumas that Black women deal with, and also the added layer of being a Black woman. So Black and female, some people call it double jeopardy. I call it double magic. But anyway, it discusses some of the things that Black women have to navigate in talking about issues of sex and race, and so at that intersection. And then the last section is for my community, which brings in the kinds of stereotypes that Black men have to deal with that ultimately affect Black communities, and also the kinds of things that we have to deal with as Black people, having been brought up in a racist, sexist culture. So what I'm going to talk about today is from a piece called Still Enchanted After All These Years, which is in the community, for my community section of my book. And that picks up about Harold Washington, which this year is the 100th anniversary of his birth. So I thought it would be timely to talk about that. Harold Washington was a reform statesman. I don't even like to call him a politician, because he was really concerned about making sure that every single neighborhood in Chicago was properly dealt with, invested in, and that every person in Chicago had a fair chance and opportunity to do well. So with that as a backdrop, I will just move on and say that you'll see the C banner now, because I like to make sure that everything I do is presented from a healing perspective. The Black American journey has been full of pain and struggle, to be sure, but it's also been marked by magnificent human achievement, magnificent triumphs. And so as a psychologist, I like to present everything in an empowering and healing frame. When I was teaching at the college level, I taught at 2 HBCUs. What I noticed really empowered my students was when I infused my psychology classes with their own history. And that just really made them come alive. So knowledge is healing. And I have a quote here from Dr. Naeem Akbar, who is a psychologist who talks a great deal about visions for Black men. In fact, that's the name of one of his most famous works. And he talks a lot about what Black men need to do in order to be fulfilled. Things like institution building, things like making sure that they're attending to their own psychological health, because we all need to do that. And so his quote is, "The ultimate effectiveness, power of any group of people is the degree to which they have an awareness of who they are and respect for themselves. One of the major deficiencies of the African American community is the persistence of a fundamental lack of self-awareness and a debilitating deficit of self-esteem. These characteristics are not new for the African American community, but are deeply rooted in a tradition that was devised to sabotage our collective and personal efficacy and make us into a permanent class, a permanent servant class in America." And I want to just stop there for a second and say that in the culture today, you see that there's so much activity wherein the power structure is trying to make sure that you do not get access to your real history. We've been fed a diet of information that is incorrect, that omits a lot of our history, which, as I've already said, has been quite magnificent. What we have lacked, as you will see in this presentation, is equal protection under the law and due process. We've built great communities, we've done great things, we've done all kinds of scientific, we've invented things scientifically, we've done all kinds of things culturally. Culture is always appropriated because we have done such great things. But what we have been consistently locked out of is a knowledge of self. And there's a great axiom that says, man must know thyself, right? So if I asked you to think about what comes to mind when you think about Chicago, what 3 to 5 things come to mind when you think about Chicago? I'll bet you one of the things you think about is violence. Well, what I think about is corruption, violence, racism, majestic beauty, and stunning Black achievement. So let's start from the beginning with DuSable. Jean-Baptiste Point DuSable is the founder of Chicago. He arrived in the 1770s, they say circa 1772, but different sources will say different things, but DuSable is described as handsome, very dark, and adventurous. He was smart and well-educated, spoke several different languages, and he was the first non-Indigenous person to take up permanent residence on the banks of the Chicago River near Lake Michigan. Now, DuSable was well loved and well respected by the Indigenous community. He was known for fair trading and treating people properly, treating people right. He was a prosperous fur trapper, a trader, a farmer, and a philosopher, just a very smart man. And DuSable came here from Haiti. He first was in what they called New France, which is today New Orleans. But he came here from Haiti, which is why I'm so happy to be doing this lecture in conjunction with the Haitian American Museum of Chicago, a great institution doing important work, the important work of preserving the phenomenal culture of Haitian Americans. And as you know, the Lakeshore Drive was recently named after DuSable. And so not quite 20 years after DuSable settled what the Indigenous people called Chicago, Blacks in Saint-Domingue began their revolutionary run toward independence, wherein they defeated Napoleon in France and became the first free, independent Black nation in the Western Hemisphere. Now, this is so significant because it reverberated all over the world. Now, if you've studied Napoleon in your traditional American schooling, what you heard was Napoleon was the best, baddest, most incredible military genius walking. Well, that was until he met Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who declared Haiti to be free on January 4th, 1804. So that statue of DuSable, it is downtown, and I'm sure you've probably seen it. A lot of things named for DuSable, including the DuSable Museum of African American History. So with that, I always say that it really annoys me that so many Black people live lives that are really beneath the genius and talent of our people in Chicago, especially considering the fact that this city was founded by a Black man. But anyway, not long after, let's go to the corruption of Chicago, which kind of took place long after DuSable had already left. So from the very beginning, Chicago has been corrupt. It is consistently named as one of the most corrupt cities in the nation. Illinois is corrupt. You had early on colorful characters. You had con artists, you had pickpockets, you had grifters and gamblers, lots of killers roaming around, a lot of brothels, all up and down what is now a certain section to the south of the Loop. You had famous brothels. One particular brothel was manned by the Everly sisters, and they were internationally famous, and they were protected by the police and by elected officials. You had colorful officials like Bathhouse John Coughlin and Hinky Dink Kenna, who were aldermen, and back then there were 2 aldermen per ward. And these 2 guys were just notoriously corrupt. They were saloon owners, and they shook down business people. They were involved in the white slavery trade. Drugs were rampant in Chicago. All manner of things were going on. There was a vice district called the Levee that was internationally famous, and gangsters abounded here. So when people like to talk about Chicago being corrupt, they need to understand that this is a long-standing problem that we have yet to get a hold on. And so this is one of the reasons why when Harold Washington finally came around, it was so breathtakingly beautiful, because finally we had someone who was committed to stamping out corruption and patronage and all of those things that make this city so inequitable. And so In 1894, so this is talking about way back in 1894, a guy named William T. Sneed, who, as an aside, died on the Titanic. He was a British journalist who came here and wrote a book called If Christ Came to Chicago, which was a scathing expose on all the vice and all the corruption and all the horrible things that were happening in Chicago. And then there, more recently, more contemporary times, in 2004, James Mariner wrote a book called Grafters and Goo-Goos. So corruption and reform in Chicago from 1833 to 2003. And graft, of course, he's talking about corruption, but Goo-Goos was kind of a derisive term used for people who were interested in good government. And so he also, it's a good book to look at how there's kind of been some people would say, some scholars say, an actual alliance between people who were corrupt and business people and government and police. So with that understanding, let's go to violence. I say that I think of appalling violence. Now, nowadays, people like to use Chicago as subscript. Whenever you hear about violence, oh yeah, look at Chicago. Whenever you hear about police brutality, you have people say, well, try policing Chicago. And so underneath all that is this notion that somehow Chicago is violent because a lot of Black people live here. And I just want to dispel that right now. Chicago has always been violent. At a time when this city was building up to its present day majestic beauty, which was at the time of the World's Fair in 1893, H.H. Holmes, one of the first, if not the first serial killer, was running around Chicago. And this was a well-educated man, a pharmacist, a person with a medical background. He was luring the young girls who were coming in from the rural areas into what some people call his chamber of horror. He actually constructed the inside of his building to have chambers and trapdoors, and he literally killed people in this building. And this is all taking place as the build up to the World's Fair, where Chicago is annexing more and more land. Inglewood was a separate entity. And so it grabbed up Inglewood, it grabbed up all these different communities as it grew and sprawled out to be the big city that it is today. You had taxi wars. This was a war between yellow and checker cab drivers. Now, some of you might not even remember those big, huge cabs that used to roam around downtown. But now that, we're in the days of ride sharing and all. But these were major companies picking up tourists and picking up people who needed to get around the city. And so there was this grand competition between yellow and checker cabs. And these guys who drove these cabs actually rode down the street in the downtown area of Chicago, sniping at each other, literally pointing guns and shooting at each other. And this was while they had fairs in the back seat. So the Associated Press on July 27th, 1920 wrote, a battle between fleets of taxi cabs in which the vehicles were maneuvered according to the best strategy of tank warfare, while their drivers fired hundreds of shots at each other, raged through the early morning hours of the streets of Chicago's West Side today. The battle was the result of longstanding differences between drivers of the Yellow Cab Company and the Checker Taxi Cab Company, a rival concern. And what about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which occurred in 1929? Now, this was such an appalling event that grabbed national and international headlines that it actually resulted in the banning of what was called the Tommy gun. This was a massacre that took place on Valentine's Day in 1929, and everybody believes that Capone and who was, by the way, at that point, public enemy number one, and his outfit, that's what he called his organization, was at the core of this. But Capone, of course, always had an alibi. He was out of town. And so he always contended that he was not behind this. And I want to read just a little bit from my book about the kinds of things that were going on. You had the crime of the century, which was two rich kids from the University of Chicago who killed one of them's cousin just to see if they could get away with it. And you had John Dillinger, who of course was a notorious bank robber, who was killed in front of the Biograph Theater in Chicago. He was lured there by the famous woman in red that you probably heard about. So I write, violence in Chicago has ranged from the unbelievable viciousness of one of the worst race riots in United States history that erupted in the Red Summer of 1919, which we're going to talk about, to the spectacular brutality of the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which most officials connect to Alphonse Scarface Capone. But public enemy number one, of course, always denied involvement. Capone, Chicago's most notorious gangster, along with his outfit, extorted saloon keepers and merchants, rigged elections, intimidated voters, had a bomb squad, and by the time of his death had been linked to hundreds of murders, all while controlling city authorities. Bold, murderous hoodlums practically ruled the city during the time of Prohibition. During the sinful, gentle 1920s, Al Capone's Tommy gun, AKA the Chicago typewriter, was so devastating with its automatic rapid fire magazine that it sparked the passage of the National Firearms Act of 1934 to get it off city streets. The long taxi war, which was well underway in the 1920s, saw yellow and checker cab company drivers brazenly sniping at each other in broad daylight on the city streets with bewildered passengers inside. Then there was the two rich University of Chicago students, Richard Loeb and Nathan Leopold Jr., who in 1924 kidnapped and murdered Loeb's 14-year-old cousin, Bobby Franks, in the crime of the century, as it was called back then, to see if they could get away with it. Bank robber John Dillinger was bumped off by the FBI after exiting the downtown Biograph Theater in 1934. He had been set up by an acquaintance, the infamous woman in red. Some of Chicago's other depraved crimes were committed by dangerous extortionists like the Black Hand, who in the early 1900s mailed letters demanding money from wealthy Chicagoans, and everyday white people who executed inhumane violence for which they were rarely prosecuted, including terrorizing many Black families who moved into previously segregated white neighborhoods. And I'm going to talk about that as we go on. So again, Chicago has always been violent. So trauma. Let's talk about trauma for a second. What is trauma? It's defined by Merriam-Webster as an injury, such as a wound to living tissue caused by an extrinsic agent. It can also be a disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional stress or physical injury. It's an emotional upset. We can also think of trauma in terms of something that occurs when something happens that overwhelms the person's capacity to combat it or deal with it effectively. Now, just want to get that definition out there so that we can all be on the same page in terms of what I'm talking about when I talk about trauma, the trauma that Black people have endured. So as a prelude to the Great Migration, I want to talk about that a little bit because it's so important in the history of Chicago. The Great Migration, some people will use different dates, but generally it's thought to have been from 1915 to 1970. And it happened that 6 million African Americans fled the South. And what I write in the book, I say millions of Blacks fled the baffling, perplexing, irrational, and gruesome racism of the Jim Crow South. And so Southerners were effectively running roughshod over Black people with impunity, trampling upon their rights. And this was everything from voting to housing to jobs. Black people were being cheated out of their wages, run off their land, thrown out of their jobs, thrown out of towns completely. You had sundown towns. They were fiercely discriminated against. They were thrown out of jobs and public office because remember, right after slavery during Reconstruction, Black people made tremendous gains. They built their own homes, their own churches, their own communities. Many of you remember that we commemorated the 100th anniversary of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the Greenwood district, which was a Black thriving community, so much so that they called it Black Wall Street, was just brutally just destroyed by resentful whites who really were just jealous of all the gains that Black people had made. It was just wonderful what Black people were doing. You had Black doctors. In fact, you had a world-class Black surgeon who was murdered in that Tulsa massacre. Some people call it riots, I'll call them massacres. And so, but it wasn't just Tulsa, it was all over. It was Rosewood, it was places in Alabama and Mississippi. South Carolina sent several people to the legislature, sent people to Congress. Black people were thriving despite the horrible racism and the oppression that they were still enduring. But nevertheless, you had all these other things going on. Obviously, you had sharecropping, you had people who were subjected to what was called the convict lease system, wherein they basically criminalized Black life. So what do I mean by that? So 2 or 3 Black men could be standing on a street corner or on the side of the road, more likely in rural areas. And just because they were standing, they are doing, talking and doing what people do, socializing. They could be run in on a vagrancy charge, and you would think that that was, something major, because they would be fined huge sums of money that everybody knew they could not pay. And so in order to work the fine off, they would have to, they would be leased out by the sheriff to companies and farms to basically be put into a form of neo-slavery. It was just another form of slavery. So yeah, and of course there were lynchings taking place. And it wasn't just Black men, Black women and children were being lynched. Black people were being harassed and beaten and having to observe all kinds of irrational norms, like not looking white people in the eye, having to jump into the dirt off the sidewalk if a white person was walking by. And voting, of course, that was always a fight over voting, just like we see today. Black people were beaten and killed at the ballot box. They were told to take literacy tests and asked to recite portions of the Constitution, things that the people who were asking them to do couldn't do. And certainly white voters weren't being asked to do these things. So many egregious, harmful things were taking place in the South. So many of them, fled to the North. So the Defender was a big source of luring people to Chicago. Chicago was considered the promised land. And I have a picture of a book called Black Majority on the next slide. And the only reason I put that up there is to remind people that there were a lot of Black folks in the South. And so having to leave their home like that is itself considered a trauma. People write about migratory trauma. Imagine having to get up and leave everything you ever knew, your family, because some people, couldn't afford the whole family to come up. So all kinds of trauma taking place. There were Black majorities in South Carolina, Mississippi, and, even the states that didn't have a majority had huge numbers of Blacks. So you had a form of apartheid, legalized apartheid taking place in the American South. And if we could just go back to the slide that we just left, I want to talk a little bit about Wilmington, North Carolina, which had a government that took place as a result of fusion politics, where Blacks and whites got together and elected Black and white officials. They had a wonderful, thriving town. Wilmington at that time was majority Black. There are a lot of whites there, but it was majority Black. And it was a thriving community. And once again, just like in Tulsa, resentful whites with the apparatus of the government, with the sheriff and the man who ultimately became mayor after they turned out the Black and white elected officials, they were all involved. This was a plot that took place over months and months of time. And eventually, a lot of people say that this was the first and only, but probably there were more coups d'etats in United States history. And so I have a little clip here just to show you and tell you a little something about Wilmington, North Carolina, which, by the way, is where Michael Jordan is from, just as an aside. If we have that clip.
For a long time, if you went to the library in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was one thing you weren't allowed to research.
We were refused. We were rejected by the librarian.
When I asked about or inquired about 1898, they wanted to know why.
I was told that, yes, they had something, but they kept it under lock and key.
The story of Wilmington in 1898 still isn't widely known.
What happened here on what's now just this empty patch of grass would radically change racial politics in North Carolina.
This is the story of an American election, but also of something we don't usually find in American history: the violent overthrow of a democratically elected government. In the late 1800s, Wilmington, North Carolina was the state's largest city. It had a majority Black population, and historians today describe it as a rarity in the post-Civil War American South.
Wilmington, prior to November 1898, was what the New South could be at the cusp of the 20th century.
There was an unusual degree of Black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful Black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, but also Black elected officials. And for a time, that was true throughout the state. Take a look at the politicians on this poster of the 1889 North Carolina House of Representatives. Here at the bottom are Black Republican representatives, some from Wilmington. North Carolina also sent 4 Black Republicans to the U.S. Congress between 1875 and 1899. The Democratic and Republican parties of 1898 in many ways occupied opposite parts of the political spectrum than they do today.
Most African Americans were voting for the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party was white voters almost exclusively. White supremacy was the central focus of the platform for the Democratic Party.
Republicans in North Carolina were successful in part because of a third party called the Populist Party, made up of mostly white farmers fed up with the tough economic times. North Carolina populists joined up with Republicans to form what they called the Fusion Party. And in the elections of 1894 and 1896, the Fusion Party defeated the Democrats in sweeping victories statewide. That meant North Carolina now had a government that shared power between Black and white politicians, including a newly elected Republican governor. Together, they moved towards reforms that would favor Black Americans and working class whites.
This was something that the Democratic Party folks were simply not going to accept.
A multiracial government wasn't just a disappointment for Democrats. It was more like a humiliation. They needed a plan to take back control of the state in the next election. So party leaders like Furnifold Simmons, future U.S. Senator, Charles Aycock, future North Carolina governor, and this man, Alfred Moore Waddell, came up with one: to beat the Fusion Party by luring white populist voters away from their alliance with black voters. Wilmington, with a large black population and a local fusion government in power, would be a focus of their campaign. The state Democratic Party handbook for 1898 laid out their goal: consolidate the white vote by stoking white anger and resentment. It said, "This is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it."
So let's say you have to read an incredibly long email from your boss that you have to finish before the big meeting.
The most effective tool was the media. One of North Carolina's biggest newspapers was a Democratic Party mouthpiece. It ran racist political cartoons throughout 1898.
Not everybody was literate in 1898, but to see a political cartoon of the type that ran, you may not be able to read it, but you know exactly what it means.
Many of the cartoons were centered on the threat of Negro rule, even though the fusion government was mostly white. They also played up another fear.
Black men threatening white women became a theme. White men need to do all that they can to protect white womanhood.
So unfortunately, blacks being attacked, whites attacking blacks is an intrinsic part of this country's sordid history. Those are some of the things that they want to omit and make sure that nobody knows about. Because when you start talking about, how come black people live in certain areas of certain inner cities and how come, they're not doing better? Well, because we've never had equal protection under the law. We've never had due process. And because in order to maintain a social order that existed in the antebellum days, attacks on Black people in this country has been practically de rigueur. It's happened over and over and over and over and over again. There's been a desire to maintain Black people in a subordinate role in this country. And I also want to say, we're looking a lot at what the Supreme Court is doing today. And throughout a series of horrible cases before the United States Supreme Court, during this time period, Black people were literally begging the United States Supreme Court to stop all the massacres and violence that was taking place. And it started right after the Civil War in 1866 in Memphis and New Orleans. You had Black people being literally slaughtered and massacred. They were begging, appealing to the United States Supreme Court. And in a series of horrible cases, the court just failed Black people. Now, I know that this is a lot of trauma. So one of the things I want to talk about with the migration is that even though when Black people got here, they discovered that this was not the promised land, and in fact, destructive racism took place here. The fact of the matter is Black people were able to build what they call Black metropolis. We had so many Black people doing so many extraordinary things. We had people like Jesse Binga, who had the Binga State Bank. Unfortunately, when he decided that he wanted to move out of the Black Belt because he had so much wealth, of course, he wanted a bigger house for his family. He was bombed. His business and home were bombed just innumerable times. We had Anthony Overton, who had a conglomerate. The Overton Hygienic Conglomerate was made up of so many different things. So he had a cosmetics company, he had a food company, he had the Chicago Bee newspaper. And in fact, his building still stands. It's on the next slide. And the building is still standing at 36th and State. And he was a millionaire chemist, a lawyer, and he studied at Harvard Business School because he was the first Black man to have a conglomerate business. His building, he rented office space to other Black professionals. And he had at one time a sales force of 400 people and a salaried sales force. So just going back to that other, okay, I'm sorry, I see. some of the questions coming in, which I'm supposed to ignore. I just want to say that one of the things that made it so that Black people could become successful in Chicago is that we were coming off the First World War. And part of the thing that lured them to Chicago was the labor shortage that was created as a part of World War I. And so at this time, you've got Black people coming in, getting good jobs. And then at the end of the war, after the demobilization of the war, you've got all this tension, right? Because now you've got all this competition for jobs that white people had not been used to having. You've got a tinderbox in the Black Belt where Black people have been confined. Every time someone tried to move out of the Black Belt, they were met with tremendous violence. So you've got a tinderbox cooking here. And so by the time we get to 1919, which I'm going to skip up because I know that we're kind of running out of time, you have a situation where you've got all kinds of problems in the Black Belt. You've got Black people living in places where you don't even have running water. You don't have electricity. Some people did not have heat. You were sharing rooms with other Black people, and they were carving up apartments into what was called kitchenettes. They were packed in such a way that it was a fire hazard. Fires broke out in the Black Belt all the time. You had horrific overpricing, but because Black people couldn't move into other neighborhoods because of the determined racial segregation, they had to pay whatever they were charged. So you had them in adhesion contracts, what you call in the law adhesion contracts, which basically means take it or leave it. And so white people were psychologically distressed because they had to compete with Blacks for jobs, housing, and opportunities. And so at the same time, you've got Black soldiers returning, and these soldiers have seen the world. And so they're looking and they're saying, well, wait a minute, you know, I fought for democracy too. I fought to make sure that this country was safe. And so why should I be treated like a second-class citizen? And the Defender, which is at that point an extremely powerful paper, is writing extremely well-written, analytical reports about what's going on in society. And those papers, and by the way, at one time, the Defender was banned in the South. They were smuggled into the South by the Pullman porters. And they were banned because of the hard-hitting editorials that they consistently wrote. And they wrote things like, well, why should Black people be, why should they be mistreated when you've got Black folks who have fought for this country and who are doing magnificent things in this country? And I know we're kind of off the slides, but I'm kind of trying to rush through so that we don't run completely out of time. So leading up to the Red Summer, and by the way, don't forget that we had a pandemic in 1918. So you got all these things taking place. And so the Red Summer of 1919 was when there were race massacres all over the country. And Chicago's jumped off when a young man named Eugene Williams swam into the so-called white section of Lake Michigan. And there was a police officer there, and he just stood there and watched as that little boy, who was about 19 years old, was stoned to the point where he drowned. And so that kicked off the Chicago installment of the Red Summer. And Ida B. Wells, you know, you can't talk about Chicago without mentioning Ida B. Wells, because we were so fortunate to get her, even though it was under horrible circumstances. She was exiled from Memphis for writing her hard-hitting editorials about lynching. Ida B. Wells made it clear through her courageous research and brilliant analysis that lynchings were the byproduct not of indiscretions with white women. No, they were byproducts of Black men achieving economic success. And lynchings were meant to intimidate and scare whole Black communities into accepting economic deprivation and second-class citizenship. And Ida B. Wells was writing against a social order that was determined to operate on a white supremacist ideology. So with her, in effect, deconstructing all of the dogma that had been put forth, she was run out of Memphis and landed in Chicago, where she continued doing her activist work. I said at the top that Mariner had written a book called Grafters and Goo-Goos. Well, Ida B. Wells was definitely a good government person. She actually worked in the criminal justice system. She was a probation officer. She continued to investigate lynchings all over the South, but she also worked right here in Chicago with people like Jane Addams and other reformers. In fact, the first Black undergraduate of Harvard, a guy named Harold Greener, he and Ida B. Wells worked together to put forth the first Black kindergarten for Black children in Chicago. So just a magnificent figure she was. And by the way, just as a quick aside, Greener's daughter, Belle, passed for white, and she was an assistant to the financier, J.P. Morgan. She was his librarian who was responsible for getting rare manuscripts and artifacts and rare books for his library. So I know I'm out of order with the slide. So why don't we just hop to Black periodicals, slide 21. Just want to say something about the Black press, because it's because of the Black press really that we know a lot of the things that we know, because they were writing with a degree of honesty and integrity that a lot of papers simply weren't writing with. So by 1919, there were about 450 Black newspapers, and Claude Barnett, no kin to Ida B. Wells' husband, Ferdinand Barnett, founded the Associated Negro Press right here in Chicago. And he got news out to a lot of different news organizations and organs all over the country. And of course, you had the Defender here, which made its founder, Robert Abbott, extremely wealthy, a multimillionaire. And so they were writing things like, if we must protect ourselves, we shall do it with a vengeance. And then I just have another quote here from another Black paper, the Brooklyn Eagle. It says, "We are demanding our rights. If that modern KKK thinks that these hard-fighting, straight-shooting veterans of the World War are the same timid field hands crouching in terror, they have another think coming. We have helped to gain the victory for democracy, and we must share in the fruits." So all of this is going on, and I've already talked about Eugene Williams drowning in Lake Michigan, and this really being the catalyst for the Chicago installment of the Red Summer. And I have there at the bottom that on July 27th, 1919, the Chicago Defender reported that the whole South Side was in an uproar. Police officers were involved, city officials were involved, and whites, including tons of gang members, rampaged across the South Side, indiscriminately attacking Black people. Of interest is that the first mayor, Daley, was a 17-year-old gang member at that time. He never would say whether or not he participated in the Red Summer, but it's pretty much understood that he probably did, and he just refused to admit it. So anyway, all told, by the end, 23 Blacks and 15 white men were dead, 537 were injured, 342 of whom were Black, and an estimated 1,000 people were homeless. Most of those were Black people. And so I have here just a headline of the Chicago Defender that says, "Riots Sweeps Chicago." And here's just a little journal entry from a Major Leonard Woods, who says, "There has been considerable Negro hunting today and considerable excitement in some sections of the city, some sniping." So the Newberry Library, which is a wonderful library here in Chicago, if you haven't taken advantage of it, please do. they have some wonderful programming taking place there. What they have, their historical summary says the riots were terrible. So was the aftermath and expulsion from history. Only a handful were tried and saw any prison time, most of them Black. Many of the riot's most vicious offenders were whites protected by law enforcement and local politicians. So let's throw in a triumph. I want to tell you a little something about the Pollock family, because we just got off the Super Bowl. We just saw the Super Bowl. And as it turns out, there was a Black family here who all of the children did extremely well. So John Pollard had fought in the Civil War, came to Chicago in 1880s. He was a barber in Rogers Park. And right now they're trying to make the house his family lived in a historic landmark. His wife was a dressmaker who carried a gun in her housecoat pocket because they faced so much racism and really low-key violence. And so she, like Lorraine Hansberry's mom, whom I'm going to talk about in a moment, kept a loaded gun to protect her family. And as it turns out, Fritz Pollard turned pro football, played pro football. He was a halfback out of Brown University. He turned pro in 1919. You know, Brown University is an Ivy League. He led them to the Rose Bowl, by the way, and he served in World War I before he played pro football. His sister, Naomi, was the first Black woman to graduate undergraduate from Northwestern. Another sibling, Artemisa, was the first Black licensed nurse in Illinois. His brother, Luther, was one of the first Black silent film directors. His brother, Hughes, was a jazz musician who traveled the world. And Fritz, whose name was Frederick Douglass Pollard, was the first Black quarterback and head coach in the NFL, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame finally in 2005. To throw in a couple other things, his son won a bronze medal in the 1936 Olympics, and one of his teammates was Jesse Owens. And also, while we're talking about Northwestern, can't forget that Ferdinand Barnett, who was Ida B. Wells' eventual husband, graduated from Northwestern Law School in 1878, well, what became Northwestern Law School. And Dr. Daniel Hale Williams graduated in 1883 from what was to become Northwestern Medical School. And he was the first, of course, to successfully perform open heart surgery at Providence Hospital, which he founded, and as a training ground for Black healthcare professionals who were not able to get training in other hospitals because of racial discrimination. I want to talk real briefly about Carl Hansberry. Carl Hansberry, Lorraine Hansberry's father, Lorraine Hansberry, of course, wrote the award-winning play Raisin in the Sun with the great Sidney Poitier and Ruby Dee. He purchased a home at 6140 South Rhodes Avenue. And at that time, you had racially restrictive covenants written into deeds. And right the very next day after he moved his family in or purchased the house, his next door neighbor filed suit saying that he couldn't live there because of a racially discriminatory covenant. He hired some of the best Black lawyers, Earl Dickerson, who's considered the father of Black lawyers, and Stratford, who was the son of a man who had come from Tulsa. His father had owned the Stratford Hotel, which was one of the best hotels in the country, burned up in the Tulsa riots. But this is the kind of brilliance you have settling in Chicago. So this was a landmark case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they won on a technicality, but nevertheless, it laid the groundwork in 1940 for what would eventually be a case called Shelley versus Kramer in 1948 that substantially overruled racially restrictive covenants. This is a headline from the Chicago Defender: Hansberry decision opens 500 new homes to the race. But unfortunately, it didn't. do a whole lot to knock out some of this or dismantle some of this segregation, because even after he won that case, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, you had racial attacks every time Black people moved into different neighborhoods. When they moved into Airport Homes in 1946, thousands of white people surrounded the area demanding that they be taken out. Same in Fernwood Homes in 1947, Inglewood in 1949, when white people thought a Black family was moving in, and it really was a Black man coming to a union meeting at a home. More than some accounts estimate that 10,000 white people showed up and cracked the windows, threw little fire bombs into the home. It was just horrible. And then in Trumbull Park in 1953, we had Black people having to be escorted to and from their homes and apartments by the police. So this violence tied to housing was a serious, serious thing in Chicago. And so the next slide contains a quote by Lorraine Hansberry, which she says, and this is from To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, "I think then that Negroes must concern themselves with every single means of struggle, legal, illegal, passive, active, violent, and nonviolent. That they must harass, debate, petition, give money to court struggles, sit in, lie in, strike, boycott, sing hymns, pray on steps, and shoot from their windows when the racists come cruising through their communities. The acceptance of our present condition is the only form of extremism which discredits us before our children." So all that's a prelude to Harold. So Harold comes at a time when you've got horrors in housing, deep segregation, you got violence in the neighborhoods where Black people are being attacked on the regular, you got education horrors. Instead of letting Black kids go to schools right there in their neighborhood, they're being put in trailers. There's a famous saying here called the Willis wagons, because at one time Black kids were put into trailers outside of school buildings. And the Willis wagons was a derisive term, which was named after the school superintendent, Benjamin Willis, who oversaw all this horrible inequity in schools. At one point, and this is all the way up to 1963, I think it was, you had more than 100 parents and students and supporters to go into downtown Chicago in front of City Hall protesting the horrible conditions in Black schools. You had patronage job horrors throughout the history of this city. You had Black people being locked out of city contracts, and horrendous police brutality, which of course gave rise to the Black Panthers and Fred Hampton. And Harold Washington was a father. His father was a lawyer. His father was a lawyer and a Democrat who had come through the ranks. Harold went to DuSable High School, was in the military, graduated from Roosevelt University, went to Northwestern Law School, class of 1952, when hardly any Blacks were there. He was a city prosecutor, 3rd Ward precinct captain, a state rep, a state senator, and a sitting congressman by the time he was drafted to become the mayor of Chicago by a group of people who had decided that enough is enough. They'd had enough of all the horrific things that went on in Chicago, and they drafted Harold. Harold said, "Get me 100,000 signatures and I'll know you're serious." They went out and got that. And, just to wrap it up, because I know we're over time, by the time we finally got to Harold, this city was plunged into mourning when he died, because finally we had someone who saw us, who recognized us, who understood our ambitions and dreams and understood the ways in which we had been mistreated. And Harold was about fairness, trying to make sure that every neighborhood got equal share in terms of resources and in terms of opportunity. And I am ready for questions.
Great work, Dr. Sherrod. You covered a lot of ground in a relatively short amount of time. Okay, so we have already a few questions in the chat. Let me just scroll up. All right, so our first question is about Lori Lightfoot. Okay, so any politics aside, do you consider the election of Lori Lightfoot as a significant achievement for Black women and LGBT causes?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that I supported Lori, and but I couldn't vote in Chicago because I'm a suburbanite. But I think she's a phenomenal woman. I think that she has a extraordinary resume, and she's obviously smart and quite gifted. But I think that for Chicago to be her first elected office, that was taking on an awful lot. And I think she just really needs to get the right people around her who have deep roots in Chicago, because remember, Lori is from Michigan. No, I'm sorry, Ohio, went to school at the University of Michigan. And for a city that has the kind of history that I just briefly, tip of the iceberg, talked about, you really need to have an understanding of who, what, when, and how, who the players are, where the dead bodies are, as they say, which is why Harold Washington was such an incredible mayor, because he understood this city from top to bottom.
Yeah, she didn't come into this job in a good situation either. She came in here during the pandemic and the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. So she inherited a very tough situation.
A really tough situation.
All right. This one's just a general question about like what we do with the slides afterwards. Is there any chance to get a copy of the slides after the program?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, we're going to be posting this video on a recording of this program on YouTube. So if you want to watch that, feel free. It's on our YouTube channel, which is called the Haitian American Museum of Chicago. All right. Okay. All right. We got another question. Could you talk about the Jones brother policy?
Yeah, that's a lot. Well, depending on who you're talking to, the Jones brothers could be heroes or they could be villains. I mean, when you talk about policy, that's a lot to take on, because really the modern day lottery is what Black folks call policy during that day. And a lot of people will say that it was an underground economy, but it was also an economy that Black people were so locked out of the so-called legitimate economy that playing the numbers with a few dollars or a few quarters or whatever, whether or not that should really be criminalized is something for debate. The Jones brothers, I think everybody has to make their own decision about whether or not they want to consider them heroes or villains.
Okay. While we're waiting for another question that comes out in the chat, I kind of just want to mention that the first Black historical academic journal was like founded in Bronzeville, Chicago as well. So if they want to add something on that,
Carter G. Woodson.
Yeah, Carter J. Woodson. Yeah.
Carter G. Woodson, the library at 95th is named after him, the father of Black history, one of my heroes. Yeah,
he was the first. He was the first guy to get he was the first African American person to get a PhD in history, and the second overall to get a PhD after Du Bois.
After Du Bois, right? The second at Harvard, right? And he also went to the University of Chicago. Right.
Well, I think he taught there. I think.
Well, he was a student there. I know that.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, University of Chicago is another interesting institution. Even though today a lot of people would say that they feel marginalized and locked out in terms of the Black community, it had a little heyday where it had quite a few people like Carter G. Woodson, and also I think Benjamin Mays went to the University of Chicago, who was the president of Morehouse College when Dr. King was there.
All right, so we probably got more time for maybe one or two more questions. So please put them in the chat real quickly so that we can answer them so that Dr. Sherrod can have time to answer them. So.
Let's see, we'll give folks just a couple more seconds. If you want to ask one more question, Dr. Sherrod, thank you so much. Like, there was a lot of things that I learned from that presentation that I didn't know. And you know, I truly appreciate, you know, your knowledge and in-depth research that you've done. And I know that your book is now out. And we'll put the link in the chat too, for everyone to purchase the book. There it is. There it is. There it is. I love it. You know, the she, you know, kind of idea, you know, behind it: surviving, healing, evolving. I love that concept. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now. If anyone else has one more question, we'd love to answer it.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I was rushing and threw you off with the slides, but I'm always guilty of having way more material than can fit into the time frame.
No worries, no worries. Well, if folks do have any additional questions for Dr. Sherrod, we would love to connect you directly to her. An absolutely brilliant scholar, amazing author, a new friend at the museum. And we do thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise with us. And for everyone who's been able to join us this evening, thank you for being here. And additionally, Ben, thank you so much for, again, another fantastic Q&A, being present here and representing the museum. Before we go, I do just want to let you all know of a couple announcements and things that are happening at the museum. So like Ben mentioned, this recording will be up on our YouTube page, as well as our previous recording this month for our Black History Month celebration, Dr. Knight's lecture of Haitian immigration to America. Those are on there, as well as all the 2021 lectures. Later this week, we do have a virtual exhibition opening from Gerard Aldov, and he is a Haitian painter who is now working in Brazil, but a new artist to the museum. And again, with our virtual offerings, we're able to expand the artists nationally and internationally that we're able to bring and represent at the museum. And then coming next month in March, there are a lot of really great things happening, including a in-person or virtual, we haven't figured it out yet, artist talk with our current artist in residence and exhibitor at HAMOC, Jean-Yves Hector, as well as we are doing a collaboration with Illinois Humanities and Dr. Courtney Joseph, who donated her oral history collection to the museum. We're having a documentary screening later in March of Madansara, which is a documentary that was in Haiti talking about the merchants, the women merchants specifically at the marketplaces and their livelihoods of how they create economy for Haiti and also a livelihood for their families. And something extremely new that I'm very excited about, we are going to be having our first rum Haitian barbacoa tasting at Provisions in Uptown. It's a new program that we're putting together, a new collaboration that we're putting together. All those March events will be coming out very, very soon. Just make sure that you stay up to date on all of our social media and make sure that you subscribe to our newsletter to get all of those updates right away. I am seeing in the chat, we have from Barbara, just a word of thanks. This was very informative. I really thought I knew history. I learned so much tonight. Again, Dr. Sherrod, that is all to you. Thank you so much for really sharing your expertise with the Haitian American Museum of Chicago community tonight. We applause to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate the work that you all are doing. And I definitely will be up there soon. And I just want to say, if anyone wants to, please hit the website at www.survivinghealingandevolving.com. And also you can go to rhondasherrod.com for more healing content.
Yes, we love that. We love that. Thank you so much, Dr. Sherrod, and thank you everyone for being here with us tonight. I'll be sending out some additional information shortly with the website, with the recording link. But until then, have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to having you at one of our programs in the future.